Good afternoon. Thank you. It is one. Thank you all for being here. I'm Ross Douthat. I am a columnist for the New York Times on the op-ed page, and I am also, as of a few months ago, a visiting fellow here at AEI in social and cultural and constitutional studies. And I'm very pleased that you could all be here for my inaugural attempt to play the moderator in a conversation on society, culture, and in this case, religion. And I'm joined for this conversation by two distinguished co-panelists. At the far end of the stage is Stephen Smith, who is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego. Prior to that appointment, he was the Robert and Marianne Short Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame, and prior to that, the Byron White Professor of Law at the University of Colorado Law School. I always like to recite those kind of titles because as a journalist, you don't get any kind of chair named after important people. No, I'm not the William Safire conservative columnist for the New York Times, but maybe someday. Professor Smith is the author of many fascinating books, articles, and publications, but the book that has helped bring him here very kindly for this conversation today came out in 2018, and it's entitled Pagans and Christians in the City, and it has a great deal of bearing on the issues we'll be discussing. And then just to his left is Tara Isabella Burton, who has the career combination that almost every journalist aspires to, in the sense that she is a reporter and a novelist. That's actually not entirely fair. The line is that every political journalist is either a failed novelist or a failed politician. I think it's from Christopher Caldwell. I should give credit wherever it's due. But since I'm firmly in the failed novelist camp, I'm very, very envious of Tara at all times. Her debut novel was called Social Creature. And it was praised by the New York Times' own Janet Maslin as a wicked original with echoes of the greats, which is a great blurb. And I think I'm mildly embarrassing Tara, but really it's being made into a movie by Lionsgate, so you should probably buy the novel now before the movie comes along and ruins it. But for the purposes of this conversation, Tara is the author of a new book forthcoming later this year in June. Is that right? May or June? May. Yeah. Which is entitled Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, which explores the rites and practices of the religiously unaffiliated, or at least the formally religiously unaffiliated, from soul cycle to witchcraft. Tara was, prior to working on this book, the religion correspondent for Vox, and she currently writes a column, Religion Remixed, for Religion News Service, and she's a contributing editor at The American Interest. And she received a doctorate in theology from Trinity College in Oxford. So, for what purpose have I brought these two impressive people here today? The answer is to talk about religion in America, and particularly the possibility of a kind of post-Christian religion in the United States. And since I've mentioned both of their books, I'll mention one of my own. About, 8 years ago now, I wrote a book called Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, still available on Amazon.com, and for a low, low price. And the thesis of that book was essentially that it was a mistake to regard the United States as a country that had radically secularized over the last 50 or 60 years, and instead that the story of post-1960s religion in the US was a story of institutional Christianity's decline and the rise and often cultural dominance of what I thought should be described as Christian heresies of various kinds, forms of religion that were still in an evident debt to a Christian inheritance, that still worked off of Christian premises, but had strayed far enough from a certain common denominator of small o orthodoxy to be called heretical. So that was an argument 8 years ago, and like any argument, it does not perfectly hold up in hindsight. And one of the things that's been striking to me as someone who tries to write about religion in America on a relatively frequent basis in my day job is, I would say the last 8 years have made me less confident in the power of that sort of essential Christian core in American religious life. That it seems to me that at a certain point you can get religious tendencies and developments and patterns that drift far enough from their Christian origin point that it no longer makes sense to talk about them in terms of heresy and orthodoxy. You have to start talking about them in terms of a new religion, or perhaps an older religion come again. And I think there are a lot of tendencies in American religious life that have become more evident, maybe especially in the age of Donald Trump, that merit a different descriptor, a descriptor like pantheism, or a descriptor like neo-paganism. And some of these are the kind of things that Tara has written about. Some of them are perhaps a revival of a more deep-seated historical trend that Steve has written about. But they add up, I think, to at least the possibility, the interesting possibility, that somewhere between astrology and the New Age and the neo-pagans of the alt-right and the witches putting hexes on Brett Kavanaugh and academic pantheists celebrating Whitman and Spinoza, you have a very powerful post-Christian current in American religious life that is not secular by any means, that is sort of decisively not spiritual but not religious, but spiritual and in some sense religious. And so that's what I'm hoping we can talk about today. So the order of battle is essentially that I've asked Tara to talk about her journalism and sort of the sociology of this tendency and how perhaps it shows up in her reporting and experiences. And then I'll ask Steve to give sort of more historical perspective on the idea that maybe there's always been this kind of tension and tug of war and delicate dance and ruthless conflict between Christianity and paganism, and it was never the case, in fact, that Christianity somehow simply won and paganism simply lost at the end of the Roman Empire in the West. It's a much more complicated story than that. So that's how we're going to go, and then I will try and do I have a few pointed questions. We'll have a little bit of conversation on the stage, and then we'll throw things open to questions, and we'll try and finish up somewhere between 1:15 and 1:30. And the last bit of news for all of you is that I was driving to the airport to fly down here this morning, and they were, of course, reading horoscopes for the day on the Drive Time Talk radio. And I'm a Sagittarius, and they said today was a 10 for Sagittarius. So I want to thank you all for being here as part of my 10 day. So get ready. All right, and we're gonna proceed for the rest of the conversation seated in a more informal and less elevated style. So I'll turn things over to Tara as I slip into the chair beside her. Thank you all so much.
So I want to start with an anecdote about a hair salon and spa in New York. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what was once the Red Door, the Elizabeth Arden salon. In the sort of American mid-century and thereafter, it was associated with a very particular brand of elegance, of glamour, of exclusivity. To go behind the Red Door was to attain a certain social status and glamour. The Red Door is rebranded last year. It's now called Mind, NYND Spa. It is now a self-care journey with the same perks as its upscale predecessor. Its slogan is, no matter how you define self-care, Mind is a resource focused on helping you achieve lasting beauty and wellness. At Mind, you'll find self-care you can confidently say is my. It's my, not mine. That's just what it says. And I find this absolutely fascinating as an illustrative example that where you go for your kind of high-end investment in yourself, to use the sort of contemporary parlance, is not the place that advertises, wealth or a particular vision of glamour, but a kind of spiritualized notion of wellness, it's a journey now to go and get your hair done. It is, I've actually been there. You really just get your hair done. There's nothing different. It's the same as any other salon. But the narrative around it, what it advertises, is quite different. And to me, this speaks to a wider point, or the first point I want to make, which is the way in which sort of spirituality has become a very particular kind of commodity. It has become aspirational. It has become easily tradable. It has become something that you can basically go into a store or go on Amazon and buy. And one might, you can take two approaches to this. You can say, well, this is completely terrible, and this is just a horrible truth of late capitalism, which is not wrong. But it is also true that the fact that this is the hottest commodity in town, the sense of wellness, of spiritual well-being, of having a journey that you can sell products with this, I think speaks to a very particular American spiritual hunger. So, excuse me, according to a 2018 study by the branding arm of the media company Vice, it's called Virtue. That is true. 54% of millennials said that they were eager to spend their money on brands that, quote, enhanced their spirit and soul. 77% say they seek out brands that share their values. And again, these are just millennials that are being polled here, but there is very much a sense among, let's say, all Americans, but I would say particularly millennials and Generation Z, that a kind of moral, spiritual, communal hunger, and these words are not synonymous, but there's certainly overlap, is how people decide where to spend their money. This is coming, of course, at the same time that we are seeing more and more Americans, again, particularly millennials and Generation Z, identify as religiously unaffiliated. So that's 36% of young millennials and around the same number of Generation Z say they do not belong to any religious tradition. However, and this is extremely important, and this is of all the religiously unaffiliated America, 72% still say they believe in God or a higher power. And about 20% say they believe in the Judeo-Christian God. So about 20% of the religiously unaffiliated say they don't want to check the Christian box or the Jewish box, but they still say that they believe in the God of the Bible. Now, it's worth saying that often atheists and agnostics do tend to self-underreport. So it is the 72% might be a tad lower. There may be people who say, I believe in something, but but may not personally, privately feel that way. But even so, I think it's an extremely striking figure that there is just an enormous there's an enormous number of Americans who believe in something and care about something and want to spend their money on accessing that something. But for whatever reason, or for reasons which I will talk about, do not wish or feel that they can do so through the medium of organized religion. And for me, at least in my book, and my read on this, is that so much of this tension has less to do with personal faith, with personal belief, than it does with a mounting distrust in institutions more broadly, and visions of what one's spiritual life ought to be. My hypothesis, and I'd sort of love to sort of debate and discuss and see where we align and where we don't here, is that the tension isn't exactly between maybe Christianity and paganism aren't the words I would use to describe it, but between a kind of intuitionalism and institutionalism, that in the American religious landscape, there is a spiritual trend that you can find, and I see it reflected in wellness, in modern occultism, in techno-utopianism, in fandom culture, in all of these, in the rise of the cultures around polyamory, for example, a profound belief in the power of human individuality, of human intuition to rewrite the script, to remake our own worlds. There's a kind of, I believe, a unified theology you can find in these many disparate traditions that are popular with what you might call the spiritual but not religious, and what I call the religiously remixed, which is a combination of people who identify as spiritual but not religious, people who say they believe in a higher power but don't affiliate with a religion, and people who say they belong to one religion but whose practices are much more eclectic. Just one example, about 29% of self-professed Christians say they believe in reincarnation. So what do we do with that? And all of these groups together, I call the remixed. And I would motion that what unites all these different groups and all these practices popular with this group is this sort of idea that there's the self and there's society, and that the self is fundamentally good, fundamentally divine, its intuitions are fundamentally right, your desires are fundamentally pure, and a repressive society or sort of a repressive culture in some way gets between you and your truest self. And that your duty as a person who wants to achieve self-actualization through self-care is to look inward to figure out who you really are and to cast off these oppressive shackles. Now, this isn't necessarily and isn't at all a new idea in American religious life. It's, for starters, sort of the idea that we're all into astrology now or we're all into occultism now is somewhat inaccurate. In the late 17th century and the early, throughout and the 18th century, for example, only about 15% of Americans actually went to church. Practices like divination, fortune-telling, astrology, folk medicine, wordscraft, all quite common. So this isn't completely new. But also there's just a strong and robust American tradition of this kind of intuitional focused. I'm thinking, for example, of transcendentalism, of Emerson, who condemned human society as a conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members, a joint stock company in which the members agree to surrender the liberty and culture of the joiner. There's, for those of you familiar with New Thought, which was extremely popular, it was this massive craze in the 19th century. It's basically, if you're familiar with The Secret, it's basically that, but in the 19th century. It started in the 1860s and by a clockmaker called Phineas Quimby, and became this just massive best-selling publication craze where the idea was you can manifest your own reality simply by believing in yourself, simply by dreaming it, and it would arrive. A couple of wonderful sort of self-help quotes from New Thought authors. You're meant to repeat, I am well, I am opulent, I have everything, I do right, I know, and then this would happen to you. Anything is yours, if you only want it hard enough, just think of it. Anything, try it in earnest, and you will succeed. It is the operation of a mighty law. That was William Walter Atkinson's 1901 thought force in business and everyday life. So there is a sort of long-standing American tradition of this belief in both a kind of pure individualism, but also a spiritualized individualism, one in which by listening to yourself, you can affect the force, the energy of the universe. And often this language of a kind of depersonalized, nebulous energy was as common in the New Thought as it is now. But there are, I would motion, distinctive elements of contemporary intuitionalist culture that make it rather different and, for my mind, even more interesting to write about than its forebears. There's the internet, of course, and the idea that we are all sort of curating our own identities. We can mix and match. We don't have to. It's a phenomenon that the Harvard divinity scholar Casper ter Kuile and Angie Thurston call unbundling, kind of like a cable package. You can mix and match. You can get your sense of meaning from one place and your purpose from the other place, and you can do a bit of yoga and a bit of tarot, and go to Christmas and Easter services, but also your friend Shabbat dinner, and that the way in which you create your spiritual life. Someone I interviewed, Phil Zuckerman, who wrote a wonderful book on secularism, said, "Well, you curate your Facebook feed. Why shouldn't you curate your spiritual life?" And I thought, well, make of that what you will. There now exists something called the Ritual Design Lab, which is founded by designers Chrisette Ozench and Margaret Hagen, which basically, if you tell the lab what you need or want, they do this for people. They also do it for companies. They've used Microsoft has used them. They will create rituals for you to enact, just somehow, I don't know, maximize your spiritual potential. And this is how they describe themselves. The new generation wants bite-sized spirituality instead of a whole menu of courses. They frame this as a good thing. So the way in which the internet culture of this kind of curation culture, the freedom that we have not just to mix and match, but also to create, to respond to an existing text or an existing idea, not simply with acquiescence, but with a sense of entitlement that we should be able to tell our own stories. All of this has, I believe, resulted in a spiritual landscape defined by a kind of obsession on the part of many believers and would-be believers with agency, with creative ownership, with, you might say, control. You can, I'm just going to skip ahead because I realize that I'm going on a bit. And I think the last point that I do want to make before I wrap up is that it's possible to be a bit cynical and roll one's eyes at this, and I certainly have been guilty of doing that a bit in the talk. However, it's also vital to mention that for many people, this is the only access to a spiritual life that they feel they have. People who perceive that they have been marginalized or left behind or mistreated or abandoned by their faith community or in which they were raised. Iterations of spirituality that either are apart from or consciously, as in the case of elements of modern paganism, stand against the Judeo-Christian cultural tradition, are seen as sort of desirable and even acts of political resistance. I'm going to just close with a quote from a zine by Dakota Stockfleet, who is a non-binary witch at Catland Books, which was behind the Hex Brett Kavanaugh event in 2018. And there's a zine called The Ethics of Cursing that I bought in Catland, which talks about how black magic is for them a very necessary element of fighting against oppression. They code oppression as both Christianity, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy. Cursing becomes not just something you kind of do for fun or as a fun witch aesthetic, but a way of reclaiming a spiritual life in conscious political opposition. If you practice witchcraft, they write, and you have never considered cursing someone, I have to assume you haven't been through much in the way of violence, trauma, or abuse. Folk magic is what arms the poor, the downtrodden, and the outcast. How could anyone fault me for cursing my rapist? Even if I was to subject myself to the terrifying police, the exhaustion of telling and retelling the story of how I was attacked and robbed and violated to people who will blame me or not believe me, there is almost a surefire guarantee he will not be caught or brought to justice. How could anyone blame me, let alone shame me, for seeking to be the arbiter of my own justice by cursing that evil made? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's an honor for me to be here in this distinguished company to talk about some pretty interesting questions, I think. In my remarks, I'm going to try to do a couple of things. One is, as Ross asked me to do, to give a bit of a sense of the argument in the book that he mentioned, Pagans and Christians in the City. But then I also want to offer a few thoughts, speculative thoughts, on the significance of that argument for the question that's most central, I guess, to our discussion. Do we have, or are we on the verge of settling into some new American religion that would be post-Christian, maybe describable as some kind of paganism, but something that would serve the role that maybe non-sectarian Protestantism did in the 19th century? So in the book, I try to develop and defend an idea that was proposed by T.S. Eliot. Eliot argued at one point that the future of the West would be determined by a contest between Christianity and what he called modern paganism. He thought Western societies are currently Christian, or classifiable as Christian, not because they're Christian in any very deep sense, but because they once had been Christian, and sort of by default they would remain classifiable as Christian until that was replaced by, I think he said, positively something else, which he thought had not happened yet. but maybe it has happened by now. Maybe the modern paganism that he mentioned has now prevailed. And that would at least be another way of raising the question that Ross raises here, I think. Now, Eliot offered this suggestion. He said, as a help with, he said, immediate perplexities that fill our minds. He said, the current terms in which we describe our society only operate to deceive and stupefy us. And that seems right to me. And so that seemed like it was an intriguing possibility to investigate and see whether his diagnosis would help with that. In particular, it does seem that the prophecies that were once almost universally believed about inevitable secularization have by now been pretty much discredited, or at least heavily qualified. But we still tend to describe constituencies or movements or positions by putting them into the boxes of religious or secular. And yet these descriptions often seem to obscure as much as they illuminate. On many issues, the parties on both sides of a controversy seem religious. They reflect a kind of evangelical zeal, a sort of good versus evil view of the world, a tendency to want to anathematize their opponents. Secular and Christian doesn't quite seem to capture that. It seems to, so over a century ago, Chesterton said, what we see in the world is, quote, a fight of creeds masquerading as policies. And he went on to say, we've contrived to invent a new kind of hypocrite. The old hypocrite was a man whose aims were really worldly and practical, while he pretended that they were religious. The new hypocrite is one whose aims are really religious, while he pretends that they're worldly and practical. That seems to me, if anything, more true today than it was when Chesterton wrote it. But the question is, how to describe these religious divides, and Eliot's diagnosis, it seemed, might be helpful in doing this. Now, that diagnosis, I think, generates a major objection, and that is that paganism just doesn't seem to be a term that describes, important positions or movements today. It is true we hear more about Wiccans and Satanists and so forth, and these are interesting movements and so forth, but not really politically and culturally salient, well, at least politically, let's say, actors, it seems, especially in the academy where I live. My progressive friends in the academy who have managed to read the book find the description of some of them as pagans as just either amusing or insulting, but just not plausible at all. Now, my response to that objection is to suggest that they're right in rejecting this if you equate paganism with myths about Zeus and Apollo and so forth, or with sacrifices and auguries and that sort of thing. But I think it's more helpful and really, in a sense, more perspicuous, let's say, to understand paganism as imminent religiosity. Put it this way, if religion, which of course is a much disputed term, is taken to refer to an orientation toward the sacred, then we can ask for somebody, what is the sacred for them, or more specifically, where is the sacred? And the pagan answer is the sacred exists within this world. It's imminent. It's an imminent religiosity. Now, I don't think that in defining paganism this way, there's anything really contrived about the definition either. Basically, that's, I think, the same conceptions used in the really remarkable recent book by Anthony Cronman, Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan. But it's also, I think, really faithful to ancient paganism. In the 1st century BC, the scholar Marcus Varro distinguished among mythic religion, basically stories about gods and goddesses and so forth, civic religion, the sacrifices and auguries and so forth, and we might use the term philosophical religion. And it was possible, he said, to scoff at the mythic religion, as Varro and many others did, even perhaps at the civic religion, as Seneca did, at least according to Augustine, and still embrace the philosophical religion, then treating the stories about gods and goddesses and the sacrifices and so forth as kind of symbolic or expressive manifestations of this deeper, imminent religiosity. This probably was actually the position of many educated Romans at the time. Now, in this context, the rise of Christianity and Judaism was a radical development. Scholars like Jan Osman have explained, precisely because Christians and Jews believed in a transcendent deity. And this belief had revolutionary implications for views of the world, sexuality, civic obligation, and life generally. Now, as we know, in the 4th and 5th centuries, there was a kind of on-again, off-again struggle between Christianity and paganism within the Roman Empire, and Christianity eventually prevailed as an official matter, but that's an important qualifier. This is sometimes described as the Christian Revolution, and of course it set the stage for centuries of Christendom and so forth. And yet I think it would be a mistake to think that paganism simply disappeared. In fact, I would say it survived and even flourished in various ways, but I'll mention 3. One is, I think, paganism persisted and indeed was cherished in the sort of historical memory of the West. There was a long-standing, ongoing admiration for and a desire to recover the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, to use Poe's phrase. The Renaissance, of course, was a sort of emphatic manifestation of this theme, and that theme is easily observable in a lot of the paintings of the great Renaissance masters. Secondly, and kind of conversely, in the Western imagination, I think there's been a persistent resentment towards, often hostility toward, the force that turned out the lights on, as Heinrich Heine put it, the merry dance of paganism, namely Christianity, a resentment toward Christianity. That's been an ongoing theme too, but the Enlightenment is often seen as a conspicuous manifestation of that theme. In Peter Gay's admired History of the Enlightenment, he emphasizes this anti-Christian theme and describes the Enlightenment as the rise of modern paganism. That's the subtitle for one of his volumes. But third, and perhaps even more importantly, I think it can plausibly be argued that paganism, or a tendency to sacralize the things of this world, is in a sense the natural condition of humanity. We live in this world. This is the world we know firsthand, that we're sure of. Anything beyond this world we know only through intimation or inference. And insofar as we are oriented toward the sacred, we naturally tend to locate the sacred within this world. This is actually a pretty familiar point. It's been stressed in Scripture and 1,000 homilies over the centuries by preachers and so forth. So I think it actually might plausibly be argued that despite the official triumph of Christianity in late antiquity, paganism actually remained the sort of dominant position or orientation throughout the intervening centuries. But even so, and this is important too, over those centuries, centuries of Christendom basically, Christianity has remained sort of the official position. It's supplied the regulative ideal for governing law and politics and culture and so forth. Paganism, I would argue, has remained strong, but mostly beneath the surface, not the official position. But this may be where I think things have changed recently. I argue in the book that imminent religiosity is becoming more self-conscious and aggressive. You can see this in various places. In the book, I particularly discuss the work of Ronald Dworkin, especially his last book, Religion Without God, but it's apparent in other ways as well. And if that's right, then it wouldn't be surprising to see a more deliberate effort to throw off the vestiges of Christianity as the regulative ideal. And I argue in the book that this, in fact, is what we see in recent decades. I teach constitutional law sometimes and write about it, so I talk about this in the area of constitutional law, and I think it helps to illuminate developments in the area of new constitutional rights, reflecting the sexual revolution, things concerned with marriage, also in the area of religious freedom. And this can be described, I think, as a kind of pagan counter-revolution, as an attempt to reverse the Christian revolution of late antiquity. Now, that discussion in the book takes up 2 or 3 chapters, and I won't try to summarize those here. But instead, I want to turn now briefly to the question that we're talking about on this panel. Do we see now the emergence of a new American religion, as paganism as a sort of regulative ideal, replacing Christianity or biblical religion, Judeo-Christianity, as the regulative ideal? I think it can only be tentative in addressing that question, but my answer would be yes and no. In one sense, more yes than no, and in another sense, more no than yes. So let me just sort of try to explain the yes part. I think it's plausible to say that an imminent religiosity has been the dominant, if tacit, orthodoxy for some time now. It's driven constitutional developments, as I say, and a lot else. I think it's dominant in the academy. I think it's dominant in the entertainment industry. This is not so much a prediction of what may be coming as a sort of fait accompli. But on the no side, I think that paganism or imminent religion may flourish best when it stays beneath the surface. It may be parasitic on something else, when it's camouflaged as secular neutrality or a kind of reverent scientific naturalism, or maybe it's a kind of liberal Christianity, though that's a chapter I didn't put in the book, but it's a chapter that could have been written. When paganism comes, or imminent religiosity comes out in the open as its own thing, then it may need to defend and justify itself, and it's not clear to me that it can do that convincingly. Maybe it is just too spiritually and intellectually thin to flourish, when it's actually viewed for what it is. Now, Ross, in a column a while back in the New York Times, raised questions about whether modern paganism would have the cultic resources that a successful religion would need, and I think that is a good question. But I want to just quickly point to several other deficiencies, all of which are very debatable. But one, I think that as a philosophical position, the paganism, he doesn't call it that, but he calls it religion, of somebody like Ronald Dworkin, just lacks the coherence and the rigor that either a hardcore scientific naturalism has or that Christianity has. Dworkin, he asserts, basically, that we believe in objective value, not merely subjective value, an objective meaning to life, not merely subjective. But it isn't really clear what these things even mean or what ontological foundation they have for him. Anthony Kronman's paganism, which is basically Spinoza, is a whole different story, and I don't have the time or frankly, the competence to talk about that here. But I think that is one issue. A second concern, I think, is that the normative attractiveness of modern paganism consists in commitments to things like human equality and human dignity, but these are basically inherited, I would argue, from the Christian or Judeo-Christian, the biblical sort of tradition, and it's not clear that they're sustainable, if they're removed from that sort of foundation. Just a third sort of final point here. I think modern imminent religiosity is primarily committed to secondary values, you might say, to things like human equality and dignity and autonomy. The goal, in other words, is sort of to enable human beings to live the kind of life that they choose or that we choose. But paganism doesn't have much to say about what to choose, about what kind of life really is valuable. Walter Lippmann talked about this years ago in a really important book, I think, written in the 1920s, A Preface to Morals. And he says, here's a quote, "Having won the freedom to do what they wish, modern people, they do not know what they wish to do." He said, these sort of secondary values don't really tell us what a good life consists of. So as I said, I think there is a lot to debate here and a lot that's speculative. But these kinds of considerations lead me to be skeptical about whether there's a new American religion in the sense of an imminent religiosity or paganism that we could really settle into. And I sort of think it's more likely that we're going to have an ongoing, continuing conflict and confusion over some of these things. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. So let's take about 15 minutes of conversation, and I'll try and ask questions that bring these strands together a little bit, and then we'll have a wider conversation. I wanted to start maybe with Tara's point about sort of the durability of this kind of, I'll conflate your 2 points and say the durability of imminent individualist religion in American life, right? And the fact that you have plenty of, divination and God within spirituality going back to the 18th century. It seems to me that if you look at sort of the historical pattern in American life, you have sort of either surges of that kind of spirituality or particular religious geniuses who manifest it. And then the movements and institutions that they build have historically then been sort of pulled back towards a kind of normative Christian structure or framework, to use Steve's account, right? So, to take the examples of the 2 biggest 19th century examples maybe are Christian Science, which comes out of New Thought in certain ways, and Mormonism, which gets its start in the sort of the kind of divination happy world of upstate New York in the early 19th century. And both of those, if you look at them from a sort of, how Christian are they perspective at the outset, you can make a case that they're both pretty stark departures, maybe not getting all the way to something we call paganism or post-Christianity, but clearly really stark departures. In Mormonism's case, you mentioned polyamory, right, as a feature of the contemporary political landscape. Early Mormonism goes all the way to polygamy. And then, over the course of the next 100 years, you get to a point where by the time of the 1950s and 1960s, both Christian Science and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while they're still regarded as heretical or dangerous or cultic by some other Christian denominations, are, I think, reasonably seen as connected to a kind of, a kind of Christian tradition in American life. And there's clearly an aspiration, at least among parts of the leadership of those what become those churches, to move in that direction. And it seems to me one thing that's been different since the 60s and 70s, right, is that hasn't happened to the same degree, right? So we've gone through the sort of Marianne Williamson presidential campaign, which unfortunately has not won enough support to merit the fascination that I've applied to it. But I feel like a 19th century version of Marianne Williamson would have started a church, right? And would have, and over the course of 50 years, there would be a sort of Williamsonian denomination that had some sort of ambiguous relationship to the Protestant center in American life. And, Williamson has some kind of institution now, but it's very clear that she doesn't regard herself as in that light. And the same goes for, figures ranging from Deepak Chopra to Oprah Winfrey and so on. And so I'm curious what you think, spending time in these religious worlds, what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Like, what happens to this kind of spiritual energy if there isn't one, institution building, or two, a sort of pull back towards a kind of, quasi-normative Christian framework? Does it just continue? Are we in just a sort of endless cycle, right, where astrology was big when my parents were young, and when I was growing up, I knew what my parents' sign was, and then by the time I got to college in the 1990s, nobody talked about astrology anymore, but now it's back. Like, do we just run a cycle, or what do you think happens?
So I think I would motion that, you mentioned Oprah, and I can think of Gwyneth Paltrow, that the lifestyle brand may have perhaps in some senses replaced the church as the kind of institutionalization of a certain kind of spiritual trend, which is to say, sure, Oprah doesn't have a church exactly, but at the same time, there is a degree in which sort of with enough money, with enough of a following, the sort of grassroots fringe traditions do become, like astrology, like psychics, which are now at Goop Summits, do become codified in some way. That said, and I think you do touch on a difference that I think is very significant, which is because there is no call for any of us to choose, to say I affiliate myself with this one organization, group, theology, practice, because we can unbundle and mix and match. I'm not sure where we'll go, but I do think that it is unlikely that there will be, while these trends may become institutions, they may not have the same kind of adherence because we can do something that Gwyneth Paltrow tells us to do, and then we can do something completely different, and we are not obligated or do not see ourselves as obligated to go all in. And I think to that extent, we will remain more fractured, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to manifest itself, other than I've got a sort of general sense of pessimism about it.
When you, in the worlds that you're writing about, how often are you encountering people who are parents?
Not too often, I will say.
Because that's, I think that's sort of the interesting, that's one interesting question, right, for this model, which is, to what extent, and people are having fewer children, so it's, in certain ways it's less of an issue, and maybe this, the imminent divine can just exist, sort of by converting one of Tim Carney's descendants in every generation. If you're here, Tim. Yeah, sorry, Tim. But that seems to me, I'm just very interested in, we live in a moment where suddenly I think a lot of people are observing things, the suicide rate and deaths of despair and these kind of phenomena, where to some extent there's some reckoning with the costs of a sort of purely individualized society. And it seems like the transmission of religion from parents to children is sort of an obvious place where there are incentives to say, I believe this and not that, right? Do you see that pressure entering in anywhere in this?
Absolutely. Although I do want to make the point that this is sort of we're at the sort of second generation where this is an issue. One of the most unexpected things I came across in my research was, I think it was a 2018 Pew study, I don't remember exactly, it might have been PRRI, that one of the best predictors of whether someone raised Christian, and the study was just done on Christian parents, would leave religious affiliation in adulthood was how often religion was talked about at home. So already we are seeing in the rise of today's unaffiliated the kind of knock-on effect of many people who were raised sure, they were raised Christian, but in a kind of Christmas and Easter way. So I think it's absolutely the case that, it's not just that raising children either without a faith or with a sort of intuitionalist model of how to live might push them towards unaffiliation, but that really anything short of raising children in a home in which religion is spoken of frequently, in which it very much guides the contours of the family, is likely to result in a degree of falling away. So I absolutely think that the parenthood is kind of the major indicator of generational transmission, absolutely.
Steve, I want to talk about your colleagues who were surprised to be called pagans, right? Because I think that's, in your yes but really no story, right? That's part of where the no comes from, right? That if you go and look at, it's Varro, who are your?
Oh, Marcus Varro.
Right, Marcus Varro, right. If you look at sort of the pre-Christian paganism he is describing, there is, on the one hand, a certain gulf between the elites who believe at a philosophical level and, the ordinary people sacrificing to Zeus or Apollo. But at the same time, there is also was also a certain amount of natural relationship, right, where the skeptical elites would nonetheless participate in the civic rituals, and it was seen as normal to have ordinary people believing in the gods, even if you yourself didn't, right? I mean, I may be,
But that's probably
neither of us
accurate.
are actual historians of 3rd century BC paganism, so the audience should take all this with a grain of salt. But I wonder now, right, that what Tara's describing, and particularly sort of the closer it gets to sort of specific supernatural belief, the closer you get to hexes and curses and rituals that are actually trying to accomplish something in the real world, the more completely alien it is to the sort of Ronald Dworkin, right? The sort of intellectual elites you're describing as pagan. And I'm not sure that's necessary. I sort of think that there is maybe more coherence in a kind of pantheistic world picture and less coherence in a secular materialist world picture than you. But it's definitely the case sociologically. And do you think that that's just sort of a permanent fact ushered in by scientific revolutions and so on? Like when does the Harvard faculty decide that they can be in the same camp with the people studying how to curse?
Yeah. So, I don't want to say that couldn't happen because people are surprising and history is surprising and so forth. My friends at the current, I think, would, any such suggestion, say, I see you on the way to, joining up with some Wiccan chapter or something like that, would think that that's just absolutely absurd. That's preposterous and so forth. And there is this difference, I think, between the current situation and the ancient one. And that is, I think, you were sort of suggesting this, and I think you're right, that the philosophical paganism of Marcus Varro or of some of Cicero's characters and so forth kind of grows out of a healthy, more active, concrete paganism that's developed over centuries. And it's one thing, I think, for someone to come out of a culture like that, where a very concrete form of religion with all kinds of sacrifices and maybe largely believed stories about deities and so forth is taken for granted, and then become sort of skeptically moved to want to hold on to that in a philosophical sense, but not really being able to, and still being able to coexist, kind of live and even support that kind of thing. That's one thing. That happened then, I think. I think some of that, and I want to be cautious here because people are different, and I know this is just a generalization. Some of that with liberal Christianity, I think, might be another instance of that, where there was a more concrete commitment to what the fundamentalists would have said were fundamentals, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the literal resurrection, things like that. And then some liberal Christians were able to sort of hold on to those things as expressive of, certain underlying truths, though not to be taken seriously. That's one thing. The question now, I think, is can it go the other way? Can you go from sort of a scientific naturalist culture, and then actually start believing in, whatever the different deities or rituals. Maybe, again, because I think people do surprising things, but that seems to be more difficult to do. So that's why I'm less confident that that's going to emerge as some kind of religion that will really bring people together around paganism or pantheism.
But there's a bridge, though, of sort of performative, right? Where you have people who don't, I've known these people, and people who don't abandon scientific naturalism in any formal way. They say, well, we need ritual, and I want to sort of experiment with ritual as an experiential thing without necessarily believing in the great god Pan. And how much of just in the case of sort of astrology and the occult, right? How much do people practicing these things now, millennials, Zoomers, whoever, believe versus how much do they perform?
I think it's an impossible question to answer, and I think that the furthermore, I think
that's what we specialize in at the American Enterprise Institute.
The boundaries between the two of them are quite blurred, which is to say, if you are performing a ritual, if you are sort of socially identifying yourself in such a way, if you are experiencing some sort of collective effervescence, as it were, in practicing a ritual, how would you measure it? Do you ask people, do you believe? Do you, measure their brainwaves? I think it's not just simply that's impossible to answer, but impossible to measure. That said, I do want to suggest that there might be a more of a bridge than we might think between a kind of, to get us to the great god Pan. And the way that I think about it is that this language of energy, this language of force, or the force, if we want to get all Star Wars about it, is very
It's only midichlorians, though. Like, there's a scientific explanation for the force.
My nerdery stopped there. You're beyond me. But I am the language of energy as a kind of spiritualized, but kind of scientific, but kind of there, but we don't want to talk too much about it. That pervades wellness culture. You go to SoulCycle, and up there with don't talk on your phone is other writers are affected by your energy. Please don't look at people. Please help lean into the system so that we're all vibrating at the same frequency. If you buy plenty of wellness products, there's a whole sort of expel the toxins and the toxic energy. It's sometimes used in sort of a psychological way, but it's often used in this as a placeholder. It's a stopgap for this sort of spiritual thing that's kind of about one another and kind of about the world, and it's kind of out there, and it's real. It is ontologically real, but it's not defiant. And I think insofar as many of the people who are performatively, you might say, hexing Brett Kavanaugh or hexing Donald Trump or doing such rituals, they may say, sure, I do not believe in the literal existence of the god Pan as described in classical myth. They are, however, much more likely to say something along the lines of there is an energy that is out there, that is real, that is best described with this metaphorical language, but the energy is real, even if the deity in its particularity is not. And I think that's kind of how the way in which one could get to sort of a more established vision of paganism is through the idea that these are rituals that help, these are rituals that help us tap into the primal energy within us all, and we can. And I think one of the reasons that mixing and matching is so culturally acceptable among this demographic is because fundamentally there's the assumption that it's all kind of manifestations with almost no real difference between one and the other of something sort of primordial and non-personal behind it. At least that's my take.
So let me, before we open things up, I'll offer a last provocation for both of you off that question, right? Which is that one thing the professor was saying in talking about the sort of intellectual, maybe academic, political side of this, is that at a moral level, it's heavily, if this is paganism, it's a much more egalitarian focused form of paganism, right? Than what the paganism that we associate with the much more hierarchical aristocratic societies of at least pre-Christian Rome. And one question that I have is, when we talk about sort of de-Christianization or a pagan revolution, in certain ways, we lived through one in the West, in the sense that late 19th and early 20th century Europe, not just sort of popular culture, but high culture as well, was pervaded with very explicit forms of neo-paganism in certain ways, up to and including, W.B. Yeats and the fairies, right? I mean, this is not, fairies are a particular obsession of mine, but but since that ended where it ended, right, in National Socialism and everything associated with that, I wonder if there's sort of a permanent, maybe not permanent, but I think there's a clear desire in some quarters to move beyond Christianity, but never move beyond Christianity in that way again. Do you think where sort of, I mean, you've written about sort of Nietzschean sort of flirtations and forays, and those are often on the alt-right or the far right. But I mean, do either of you think that's at all a fair description of sort of today's relationship with the aristocratic side, or the hierarchical side, or the cruel side of a sort of pagan turn?
I guess, well, I think, yeah, probably that is a fair description of what a lot of people would like to do. But I guess something that's a point that I think is relevant to that and to this kind of, make your own religion, kind of boutique spirituality type of thing, that we've been talking about, is that that may be possible under certain circumstances and plausible. It might not be under all. I've been reading over the last couple of months some of the theologians around the early 20th century who were involved in the sort of fundamentalist modernist controversy, and I don't remember which one said this, but someone said, during good times, Christians tend to favor the Greek side of their religion, and during bad times, they shift to the Hebrew side of their religion. And there's something about this kind of spirituality that it seems to me is available when things are relatively prosperous, and people have their good life, their job or their position in the university or whatever, and then they can go down and enjoy a little spirituality of this kind or another. But I'm not sure that's sustainable under other kinds of circumstances. I think there can be circumstances that can push things in the direction of something more of a choice between, and again, I think that something like the scientific naturalism or the full-blown Christianity or other kinds of transcendent religion are just more intellectually coherent and rigorous positions than this kind of mushy middle, fashion your own religion thing. And I'm not sure that things may not occur that might push us one way or the other. That's why I'm just skeptical that kind of thing that can flourish now for a time, when most the middle-class people and so forth that are probably are relatively well off will necessarily be sustainable over the long haul.
Tara, do you want a last word before we?
Sure. No, going back to sort of the 19th century model, I think it's really telling because among the occultists of 19th century Europe, my doctorate was on this, I'm going to get really excited for a second, there was this kind of sense in which real occultism, real Satanism was contraposed with the sort of bourgeois alienation of modern life. Like Georges Calhismont's Là-bas, which is written in 1891, was basically all about this sort of disaffected man who discovers Satanism, but ultimately realizes that it's just like a bunch of people dressing up and there's no real Satanism, and the real Satan is the emptiness of modern life. And sort of actual like theistic Satanism is almost coded as a kind of re-enchantment, like a desirable re-enchantment of a world in which like there really could be black masses and blood sacrifices. And I think similarly, the sort of Nietzschean model that you brought up that I see in, the Jordan Peterson / all the way to the Bronze Age perverts of, because gotta get that in there every talk, of the world, a way in which this kind of cruel paganism or the sort of brutal paganism is coded as an opposition to an unenchanted modern life, but one that re-enchants, for better or for worse, and I would think worse, I believe, the body, a biological hierarchy, that is a kind of paganism of, blood and lobster dominance, and the idea that there is just like there is something in our bodies, in our hierarchies, in nature, that is enchanted, but not necessarily good. And I think that, as in the late 19th century, that model of we're going to venerate nature as a kind of divine force because it's the only way that we're not going to end up in alienated from our materialist, technology-driven lives. I see it very much as the same thing. So.
All right, on that note, I just point, or do we have a microphone, or we have a microphone? Okay, so we have two microphones, fantastic. All right, so we're going to keep you here for at least 20 more minutes for Q&A. So let's start with you, sir, closest to the microphone. Yep.
Hi, John Askinus, Catholic University of America. I'm surprised to learn Christianity is an eminent religion, but here we are. So I think it behooves us to ask, who's witchcraft, which paganism? Diane Purkis, the Oxford scholar, had a fantastic article in the Athenaeum Review showing that contemporary witchcraft bears no resemblance, conceptually or in terms of practices, to either classical or medieval witchcraft. Medieval witchcraft, unsurprisingly, was Christian witchcraft. He talked about the body of Christ, he sprinkled a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It was enchanted with the enchantments of the day. What's striking to me about contemporary paganism is that it's highly consumerist. The emphasis is on buying products, crystals, books, zines, etc., tarot cards, and then using these as a kind of spiritual tool. So I wondered if you could talk about the connection between, dare I say, late capitalism and this kind of model of paganism.
Is that me? All right, sure.
I think that's for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the way in there are different what I would call paganisms, obviously, and I think that the theology, or the implicit theology of brutal right-wing paganism, is quite different from the resistance witchcraft of paganism. But that said, I think the way in which capitalism intersects with that is in this idea that, I mean, your sense of self, who you are, is not simply the way in which you extend into space as a body, is, in our digital age, one might say, and in our capitalist age, as much about what you buy, where you put your energy, when that energy, whether that energy exists in dollars, which are a sort of reflection of time spent in some sense, or whether it's via the time you actually physically spend in a workout class, or how you kind of project your digital avatar in the world. I mean, I think the ways in which our conceptions of ourselves and our bodies have expanded such that how we spend our money is a statement about who we are. Yes, I think on the one hand, it is quite easy, and I am certainly tempted to sort of roll my eyes and say, okay, buying a crystal that doesn't do, what does that mean to buy a crystal without effort, or to only sort of exert the physical effort on a SoulCycle bike rather than through some sort of fasting? I think it would be remiss of me to overlook the fact that that how one spends one's time and one's money are so intertwined with one's identity that it would be odd to say, well, it means something if you practice in this way, but it doesn't mean something if you spend money on it. And I'm quite uncomfortable with that. That grosses me out. But at the same time, I think that it's impossible to dissociate a capitalist witchcraft from how our expenditure becomes how we. And this is the case too with what is sort of often called woke capitalism or values capitalism, where or it's a sort of converse, whether you're buying something at Chick-fil-A, or you're buying something at Hobby Lobby, or you're buying something from Pepsi, or you're buying something from the razor brand, and I don't know if it's Gillette or Gillette. It's like Jif or Gif, I still don't know. I think the fact that how we spend our money is culturally understood to be a valid marker of who we are, is the bigger question there.
Since I picked on you already, Tim?
And yes, I do send lots of kids to Catholic school, so that is how I spend my money, is very much tied up with that. And I do not, this isn't my question, but I do want to know who cast what curse, because during this event, during this very event, Marianne Williamson has dropped out of the presidential race.
Oh, man.
Whatever energy is being exuded from this stage. But
Pause for
as conservatives, we like to say, well, the other side isn't really trying to be neutral on religion. They have their own religion. That's sort of a theme in some of what's going on here. But my question is, there's got to be varying degrees of enchantment, right? So set aside the targets. Some people, their religion is, whether it's advancing racial equality, whether it's imminent or supernatural or whatever. Who is actually preaching disenchantment these days? Because I used to think the whole left was secular and preaching disenchantment, but people like you guys have convinced me otherwise. But who's actually preaching disenchantment?
Ricky Gervais, I think. Is that right? So. Well, in the book that I've talked about a little bit, I argue that the term secular has been obfuscating. It's not really that it's wrong to say that the world has become more secular, but if you understand secular to mean something like an emphasis upon this world, then you could sort of distinguish different categories of the secular. Secular became an important term really for Christians, to distinguish it, as one phase of eternity, and it contrasted with eternity. Paganism was a secular religion, I think, located so I try to distinguish between three categories of the secular. There'd be like the Christian secular, the pagan secular that locates, Christian, by the way, I would say, true, believes in a transcendent deity who is also immanent in very important ways. But there's the pagan secular that locates the sacred within this world. And then there's the sort of secular, the way I think the term is typically used today, meaning I call it positivistic, the sort of scientific naturalist view that there is nothing. Now, that's sort of, I think, the official view, in a sense, of the academy and other sectors of life. But if you ask who really holds to it, it's not clear that there are very many people who do. I mean, I was half joking when I said Ricky Gervais, but maybe he's one who does. John Gray, would be probably a philosopher who probably fits there. There may be a few, but I think nearly everybody, when you look at closely at what they believe and what their commitments are, they believe there is something sacred. And there are not many people preaching, I think, disenchantment, or the positivistic secular outright.
I mean, I think there is a clear niche, right? I was, reading a Yuval Harari book at the airport on my way here after I got my horoscope. And I mean, Harari is preaching disenchantment. Now, you could say he's also telling his Silicon Valley audience that they can become as gods in this, disenchanted disposition. And, you can always find religion somewhere. But there's clearly, I think, there's a group of people running from Dawkins to Harari to Gervais, in popular culture, and who are pitching explicitly that. But I think their importance might be overstated, for reasons that you're suggesting, that like nobody actually, not nobody, but relatively few people are fully disenchanted. It's hard to be fully disenchanted as a human being. And, to go back to our mild dispute, I don't think pantheism is much more intellectually plausible than scientific naturalism. Especially once you get, I think the appeal of like the Dawkins set was all about this sense of like that they were a club to beat the ascendancy of George W. Bush and evangelicalism. And once that moment in American history passed, so did their appeal beyond that niche. That's my moderator's attempt at an answer. Yes.
Hi, thank you. So just a question, drawing a distinction, I think, that needs to be drawn between ritual and liturgy. So the question about whether the neo-pagan consensus is an equilibrium solution in modern American spiritual life or not, it seems like you can have all the ritual you want on a kind of individualistic remix style basis without ever getting to liturgy, without ever getting to something that's transmitted and that has the weight of practice and history behind it. And it occurs to me that that might differentiate maybe the 19th century moment from the current moment as well. Why, it's not just institutionalization, but the idea of having found a truth that's worth passing on, and that gains some of its validity precisely from forming something like a tradition. And so, two kinds of practices. There's a sort of a kind of practice you can adopt and share, and then something that has some more weightier normative significance that we associate, I think, with a lot of organized religion. So I just wonder if both of you could comment on whether that's an important distinction when we're talking about things like whether it's witchcraft or some other form of modern spirituality.
Do you want to take that one first?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I think in two ways. I'd be loath to deny the communal aspect of quote unquote sort of ritual as distinct from liturgy, because I think there is a way in which hexes or otherwise, there are contemporary rituals going to a fitness class that do have as part of their benefit, one might say, a social engagement. However, the way in which that is conceived is ultimately as a personal good or a step towards personal fulfillment. You are getting your need for community met rather than entering into a community. And I think often in the ways in which the people I've spoken to and researched would describe, whether it be fandom culture or going to a kink play party or casting a spell at Catland, the senses in which that there's community is a need to be filled, like any of these other, and in my book, I sort of, it's impossible to define religion really, but sort of roughly say you've got meaning and purpose and community as and ritual as these four elements that I, for ease of discourse, discuss. Each of these is conceived of, I think, as a slot to be filled for the individual, and the individual is ultimately at the heart of it. So when you go and you do your ritual, you are doing it to get what you need for you, and it's not wholly divorced from the transcendent insofar as in the model of transcendence that involves tapping into energy and a force and getting on the right wavelength with that energy, which is the sort of self-care, best selfism model of personal fulfillment. There is a vague link to the transcendent there, but it isn't like a formal link to a metaphysically complex system, shall we say, and it doesn't require formal commitments of belief, and it's always about the self and the self sort of self-care journey rather than about the creation of something kind of ontologically real as one might find in liturgy.
Do you think that's a good way of thinking about the hurdle that you're saying, I think plausibly, that paganism can't leap, that until you can, what is a pagan liturgy in our society?
Yeah, well, I mean, so you have these, things that you'd call pagan liturgies, right? I suppose, I don't know almost anything about them, satanic rituals or pagan rituals.
Or so you would have us believe. Go on.
All right, but those are really pretty marginal.
Right.
Right, I think. I don't think very many people or, and very many of the, politically, legally significant, salient people are really getting into that. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, that was one of the questions that I think I raised I said, is paganism just too thin? And I said, it doesn't really offer much to believe in, doesn't offer much to do, rituals and things to participate in. And then, but then I sort of second-guessed myself. I said, but maybe that's wrong, because maybe, in fact, paganism is just a way of trying to sanctify what people are already doing. It's, what you're already doing has a sacred dimension to it that perhaps you're not aware of, and maybe that's the function that it's serving. And I think that might be true for now, but it still brings me back to this question about, okay, as long as things are functioning fairly well, that may work. But if they're not functioning so well, I'm not so sure. And I think and if you look, for example, even at American history, and we were talking about institutions and so forth. I think let's say the churched or unchurched quality of Americans goes up and down. I mean, there are periods where it looks like it's going to disappear. And then, people are all leaving. And then you have the first and then the second Great Awakenings and so forth, and there's a resurgence. And Ross in his book talks about how after World War II, there was a whole, there was institutionalization, I think, was quite strong. But we get into the prosperous and rebellious 60s, 70s, and so forth, and then even up to now, people don't need that as much. But with polarization, worse conditions and so forth, I think there is for many people, there will be a need to not just have your specialized spirituality over here, and your community over here and so forth, but a desire to integrate them a bit more. And that's what I'm not sure that the forms of imminent religiosity or paganism that we see now will really be capable of doing.
Is Burning Man a liturgy?
From what I read about it, that might be. Yeah, that might be. Yeah.
I have to. 2020, maybe I'll go.
Yeah, that seems to me that if you reached a point where, as a normal upper middle class rite of passage, everyone sent their 16-year-old to a sort of localized version of Burning Man, and that you could imagine sort of that as an intermediate step towards. I think the line I used in my column about your book, Jeff Bezos sacrificing a bull, right. On the steps of Amazon's headquarters. 8 minutes, sir. Yes. There's the mic is.
Thank you. So, in terms of thinking about, I guess, from an economic perspective, of whether there's a sort of a market niche out there for a new religion, maybe, it kind of struck me that there's this sort of interest, certainly reflective of a changed society and sociology, in more female-centered views of divinity, and maybe more environmentalist, those types of things. And so the question is, those exist in this sort of individual practice, but they're not reflected in, let's say, a modern version of, let's say, the Mormon Church, but with a goddess. I mean, am I mistaking that there's a market niche out there for something like that? Or I'll just let you answer.
Well, you might know more about whether there's a market niche for it or what the tendencies are.
I think there's certainly, I think the rise of what one might call witch culture, and when I say witch culture, I mean something that is explicitly kind of neo-pagan or Wiccan or adjacent to those traditions rather than the kind of intuitionalism that's more vague that we've been talking about. I think that already is very much, back in 2014, I believe, neo-paganism was the fastest growing religion in America. And then we don't have the data from 2016 onwards, but just purely anecdotally.
Someone hexed the research department that was in charge of it.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Well, as and when it comes out, I would not be surprised based on kind of metrics as perhaps as silly, but certainly indicative as Instagram hashtags of witches. There's been a massive explosion in people identifying, again, kind of more privately as witches who not just identify with the witch aesthetic, although that has become increasingly powerful as a brand, as a commodity, but also who are kind of who are practicing, whether that is sage cleansing, whether it is lighting a candle. Hexing is a good example because it's cinematic and it speaks to a lot of the political dynamics at play. But your average witch isn't necessarily going to Catland and hexing Trump. But there were 1 million witches back in 2014, and I throwing out a number, it's about 10 million witches of Instagram posts as of 2019. I have to keep updating my book because every time I do another pass, there's 2 more million posts by witches and sort of proportional number of new witches who are identifying as such. I think that it is unlikely we will have an institution that is a kind of goddess-led institution precisely because of the way that new religions and new religious sentiments are forming, and in the age of the internet, and in the sort of also the way in which sort of which culture prides itself on is this kind of, we are anti-institutional because institution and hierarchy are patriarchal. They are remnants of a vision of religion that is inherently oppressive. I think so much of the rhetoric about resistance witchcraft and the need for a female voice in one's religious tradition or religious landscape is inextricably linked with a distrust of what witches and their allies and would-be witches see as a legacy of institution is everything they're trying to get away from. That may not be the case in the future. It may be that in a different political context down the line, we may see, I don't know, the Church of Marianne Williamson. But I would be surprised if, given the political contours of witchcraft today, it became institutionalized in that way.
Just a couple of quick points in response to your question. One is you asked about, is there a market niche for more of a religion with more of a feminine deity and so forth, and you mentioned Mormonism. I guess I think there is. I mean, there's a yearning. A lot of people don't relate well to the sort of patriarchal conception of deity and so forth, so there is. You mentioned Mormonism. As it happens, I am a sort of heterodox Mormon, you might say, or we're not supposed to call ourselves that anymore, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I think Mormons believe in a mother in heaven, and I think from blogs that I visit and so forth, there are a lot of members who find that to be something quite attractive, something that helps them to relate to the religion. That would be other. But my second point would just be that there's a certain value in thinking about religion in those terms, I think, and I think people who have analyzed religion in economic terms have actually contributed a lot of insights into religion. But I am reminded of an anecdote that I heard years ago, and this kind of relates to my doubts about the future of paganism, so I'll just tell it. I'm not sure if I'm telling it correctly, but this is the way I remember it. A graduate student, takes a class in comparative religion or something, and was kind of an unbeliever going in, but actually finds a lot of it kind of attractive and interesting and so forth, and so goes up to the professor at some point and says, I actually think I've decided I would kind of like to be a religious person. Do you think you could help me craft a religion for myself and so forth? And the professor says, yeah, get yourself killed, rise from the dead, or something like that. And then, but the serious point there, I think, is there's just something about the idea of finding a religion, crafting a religion that I think is sort of ultimately self-defeating. So insofar as there's a need for spirituality, I think it will over time push people to something that they believe is true, and intellectually defensible and so forth. And I may be wrong, but I think that happened in late antiquity. I think that's how paganism led people like Augustine to Christianity. And I think there's some kind of dynamic of that sort that will just always be in play. So,
we have 2 minutes, so I'm going to take an incredibly quick question from the gentleman seated there, and we're going to get an incredibly quick answer, and then we'll send you all on your way.
Big pressure. The topic of Burning Man, I just want to revisit that for a moment. Some factions of that would either hate that it's brought up in Washington, some factions of it would love it, I suppose. But the question of actually repeat customers type, it seemed like we didn't really go there. The concept of going one time to experience it, but it seems like there is a sustainable of a community going there on a repeated basis, including Silicon Valley. I was curious if any of the panelists had some further thoughts of that model.
yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Do you want to say something about Silicon Valley? I think the question of what Silicon Valley believes in general is really interesting. So maybe we could end with Tara on that.
I would love to go to Burning Man in part because it is the weird intersection for me of all of these groups that we talk about, from the witches and the poly communes and the Silicon Valley techno-utopians all do clearly congregate there. And I think for me, I think it's very easy to think of Silicon Valley culture as a kind of techno-utopian, as the materialists in contraposition to all of these actual spiritualists. But I think that what's telling about the kind of fact that, Bezos and Peter Thiel and what have you are all constantly going back, is that sort of the Silicon Valley culture with its slightly differently conceived, but no less robust belief in the power of a sort of human intelligence separate from the masses that would drag you down. Maybe it's more libertarian and it's society is going to drag you down with them rather than society is repressing you. But there is still such a spiritualized character in the belief in the individual. I was doing a piece that's going to come out in a couple months on Peter Thiel, and I was in San Francisco, and I spoke to one of the Thiel fellows, and he was explaining to me René Girard's theory of the scapegoat and Christ, and in Girard, in quick version, Girard's vision of Christ as sort of the scapegoat, sort of giving a lie to a fundamentally unjust and broken society. And this acolyte of Peter's was like, no, you see, Peter's the scapegoat, man. Peter, he is the scapegoat. He can't say anything these days. He had to move all the way to LA because, the people didn't like him. And there was just such a fervent belief that because Peter Thiel could, and he really basically said this, create something out of nothing, the whole 0 to 1 ideology, we could transcend our humanity in a full, profound, new, ex nihilo way because of Peter. And yes, it's a personality cult, but it is also, I think, a conviction in the power of radical, transformative, even what one might call miraculous change. That I think gives Silicon Valley its spiritualized character. So Burning Man, it's where it all happens. I hope to make it out there and update you more thereafter.
We will be the next AEI panel that I
Can we have it at
host
Burning Man?
will be held at Burning
Please.
Man, and you're all invited. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.